afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 6th day of the online seminars in Psycholinguistics. I am Pamela Toassi, and together with Professor Mayusi Mota, I would like to thank you all for being with us today. As Professor Mayusi said last Thursday, the seminar has been a great opportunity for us in such a difficult time to feel closer to each other, share knowledge, and have contact with other researchers. The seminars are being organized by LabLing and Plibimulti. LabLing is short for Language and Cognitive Processes Laboratory, and Plibimulti stands for Bilingual and Multilingual Language Processing Research Group. LabLing is coordinated by Professor Mayusi Mota and is affiliated with the Graduate Program in English and the Graduate Program in Linguistics at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, UFSC, as we call it. Plibimulti is coordinated by me and is affiliated with the Graduate Program in Translation Studies at the Federal University of Ceará, UFSC, as we call it. The seminars consist of a series of talks related to language learning and processing, including the psycholinguistics of translation processes. All talks will give you certificates, and to ask for a certificate, please fill in the Google form that will be available in the link that we'll post to the chat throughout the talk. Today, we have the honor to welcome Professor Tim Slattery from the Department of Psychology at Bournemouth University in the United Kingdom. His research focuses primarily on eye movements during reading, especially return sweep saccades, and he is interested in advancing the field of psycholinguistics through the implementation and testing of computational models. He's particularly interested in the processing of abbreviations such as textisms and acronyms, as they provide unique opportunities to explore the processing of orthographic, phonological, and semantic representations. Tim is a Psychonomic Society member, Experimental Psychology Society member, and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. During the talk, you can post questions and comments to the chat, and I'll pass them on to Professor Tim. From Professor Tim Slattery, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to participate in the online seminars in psycholinguistics. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I really appreciate it. That was a really great introduction. And thank you guys for inviting me to present my research here today. Today, what I'm going to be talking about will be about abbreviations, reading in general, but focusing on the reading of abbreviations. So let me, without further ado, begin sharing my screen, if I can, and begin. Okay, so I guess a quick question. Are people seeing just my presentation, or is it being blocked by the Zoom window at all?
I think they see both the slides and you in a short square.
Okay. Should I drag the Zoom window to a particular location on the slide?
No, Tim, I don't think it's necessary. They can see your slides very well, and you are appearing up in the upper corner.
Okay,
on the
that
right.
sounds good. All right, excellent. So the title of today's talk is Abbreviations in Reading, How Bavarian is a BMW. And that's, lots of people know that a BMW is a car, but not everybody realizes that BMW stands for Bavarian Motor Works. Those are the meanings of the underlying base words. But before I delve into deeply with abbreviations, I wanted to give a very basic overview of reading and the study of eye movements during reading. So why study reading? Well, words are everywhere. Modern society really demands that we know how to read. and that we can understand, in order to understand the world around us, we need to be able to process those words. And so reading is a really fundamental ability. And in fact, if you look at literacy level, it's highly predictive of annual earnings. And so the more literate someone is, the more access they have to well-paying jobs within various economies. Another great reason, though, is just from a purely scientific point of view. Reading represents understanding. Reading represents understanding things like memory, perception, language use, movement. There's so many different underlying cognitive processes that are involved in reading. And so understanding reading would be to understand a lot of those processes. And I really like, one of my favorite quotes comes from Abraham Lincoln when talking about, he was asked a question on what was the greatest invention according to his thinking. And his response was that written language was actually the greatest invention. And this little quote here: "Take it from us, in the Bible, all history, all science go, and all government, all commerce, and nearly all social intercourse go with it." And that's a really powerful statement, but you'd imagine where we would be today if we didn't have written language, if we weren't able to accurately record what was going on and everything had to be passed down the generations by word of mouth. There'd be a lot of distortion out there. Written language is a highly effective means of communication. And you can communicate your message through, time and space. This is a quick example of what fixations and saccades look like as you read. So the eye jumps around. It does not move smoothly across the page. The eye jumps in saccades and then pauses for moments to make fixations. I'm going to try and get a laser pointer here. There we go. So these would be fixations. The lines in between them would be saccades, where the eye is moving very quickly. And the understanding is that while the eye is paused in these fixations, these brief fixations, that's when you're encoding information about the page, about the words that are written on the page. There are a number of different types of reading saccades that we talk about. So most of the saccades that we make during reading are forward saccades. They move our eye and are focused to new words and new material in the text. Occasionally, we will skip words. This happens. Occasionally, we will also make regressions, movements backward to words we had already looked at before, so that we can look at them again. Additionally, the long movement that you see across the page from the end of one line to the beginning of the next is what's referred to as a return sweep. It's been something that I've been particularly interested in over the last couple years, as they are still not incorporated in models of reading. So if you're familiar with some of the computational models in the literature, things like Easy Reader, OB1 Reader, Swift, these are various models of eye movements during reading. All of those models are only capable of reading a single line of text. So they can't make predictions about reading a book. Reading a book requires you to make those types of eye movements. So I'm really interested in those types of eye movements as well. A few brief points of reference here. The average fixation duration during reading is around 200 to 250 milliseconds. It's strongly influenced by cognitive variables. So when I say a cognitive variable, I mean things that are reflected in your internal representations of language. So things about word frequency, contextual constraint, how likely words are within their text. All of those things influence how long someone will look at a various word. The average saccade length is about 8 to 9 letters. So people move their eye on average about 8 or 9 letters forward with each eye movement. Regression rates tend to be around 10 to 20%. They're higher with children. They are higher when you have more difficult text. Skipping rates are in the area of 8 to 20%, and they are strongly influenced by word length. Word length is the most important measure for looking at skipping rates. It's also important to understand why we move our eyes when we read. We move our eyes when we read because the fovea that contains the cones, the central point of vision, if you hold your thumb out at arm's distance, the width of your knuckle is about the size of the fovea. We need to put that fovea in places where we want to encode the fine detail that's present in the letters of words. And that's why we have to move our eyes around as we read the text. And our acuity drops quickly as you move away from the fovea. So we also sometimes refer to as a parafovea region, which is either side, about 4 degrees either side of the fovea, where you can do some pre-processing of letter shapes, but word processing is more limited in the parafovea than in the fovea. So a lot of what we talk about when we talk about language processing and reading, we talk about representations, right? Internal representations of a language. When we're talking about written language and reading, we often refer to orthography, these visual codes, the graphemes or the letters. We talk about phonology, the sound codes that these orthographic visual codes map onto, and semantics, the conceptual meaning, right? And here morphemes are sort of the smallest meaningful units within a language. And I want to differentiate a few things. So typography and orthography, and this is going to be important because of our discussion on abbreviations and the fact that they're usually capitalized, which is a typographic feature. So all of these words here have the same orthography. So they've got the same letter sequences, but they are very different typographies. Those letter sequences, the orthography is represented in slightly different ways. So the orthographic code isn't just about a pure visual code. It's really more about the abstract letter identity coding. So with orthography and phonology, especially in English, there's not a perfect relationship. So English is referred to as a deep orthography, where we have a lot of weird words, heterographic homophones, beach and beach, which sound the same but look different. But we also have homographic heterophones. These look the same but sound different, tear and tear. And regularity becomes another important point. So here we have words hint, mint, lint, tint, but this isn't pint, it's pint, right? So if the relationship between orthography and phonology was a perfect relationship, this would be pint, but it's not. Finally, when we talk about semantics, we talk about conveying meaning. I really like to describe this with the Jabberwocky poem of Lewis Carroll. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves and the mome raths outgrabe." This comes from Alice in the Looking Glass, and what Alice says, the character, "It seems very pretty," she said when she had finished it, "but it's rather hard to understand." You see, she didn't like to confess even to herself that she couldn't make it out at all. "Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know exactly what they are." And so this is that notion of conveying meaning. Most of the words in the Jabberwocky are meaningless. They're just gibberish. They don't convey that meaning. They don't have that semantic representation. All right, so that takes us to abbreviations and abbreviations in reading, because abbreviations are a neat example. And I think, so Pamela, when she introduced me, mentioned that they're sort of a unique case, because you can look at orthography and phonology and semantics in unique ways that we can't do when we have normal words in the language. So when you see BMW, does it bring to mind that? Probably. But does it also bring to mind that? Probably not, right? So people don't probably think of Bavarians when they think of a BMW. And that's part of the abstraction, right? Abbreviations are an abstraction, right? They're very common in their use. In fact, abbreviations are becoming more and more common. If you do a literature search on abbreviation use or textisms or MSM messages, all of these things, you'll find a lot of articles. There were a lot of articles early on talking about how all these abbreviations and texting is going to, ruin children's ability to read. A lot of that is obviously proven not to be true. Although I'm going to argue throughout this that a high use of abbreviations can be problematic and can distort messages. So there's textisms like LOL, and this is a fun one. LOL, how many people, just think for yourself, would have pronounced that as lol? I'm old enough where when I see LOL, I think LOL. And I know that all my young students laugh at me because they pronounce that as lol. Okay. ROTFL, I don't know if people pronounce that as rotful. I'm not sure. BRB, be right back. We also have formal abbreviations, things that I'm referring to as more formal because they're more defined. Acronyms, initialisms, and what I'm referring to as hybrids. So acronyms, the key difference here is acronyms can be pronounced as words. So NASA, FIFA, and IKEA are all acronyms, but NFL, BBC, NYSE, those are all initialisms. And there are also some hybrids. So things like X-ray, where the first letter is pronounced as an initial, but the rest of it is pronounced as a word. So there's a number of different types of abbreviations, and they all have different elements of orthographic to phonological mappings. At one level, abbreviations all abstract meaning, they abstract semantics in order to reduce letters. So NASA stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, right? People don't always have access to the actual base words, National Aeronautics Space Administration being the base words of NASA when they see NASA. They just think something about space. There's sort of an abstract indexing. There's also a high level of ambiguity within abbreviations. Because they're abbreviating, because they're abstracting away from meaning, you can have multiple letter sequences that map to the same, the same letter sequence that can map to multiple abbreviations, multiple different meanings. And in fact, there's many websites where you can go and you can type in an abbreviation. You'll see a list of different possible meanings for that abbreviation. And this is a good example, I think, of how abstract abbreviations can be. Let me go back, get my...
Shell door back online.
What's AFK?
AFK. Away from keyboard.
Oh, I see.
What does that stand for?
Oh, I see.
Yes, but what does it stand for?
So that's one of my personal favorites, where Sheldon didn't realize that she was actually saying three different words: O, O-H, I, myself, and C, S-E-E. He thought she was making up another abbreviation, another initialism. Here's another example where someone's mom said, "Your great aunt just passed away, LOL." And the response is, "Why is that funny?" And the mom responds back, "It's not funny, David. What do you mean?" And he says, "Mom, LOL means laughing out loud." To which point she says, "Oh my goodness, I sent that to everyone. I thought it meant lots of love." So these letter sequences, there's a lot of confusion, and miscommunication is common with abbreviations. Additionally, you've probably all have received work emails. This is one I received not too long ago, in which the email contained a number of different abbreviations, none of which were defined. And I was just supposed to know what EGM, WLP, and ULT meant, and I did not. And this can be a real problem, especially for new people who enter an organization, new staff members who come into an organization, and the organization may use a lot of jargon and have very specific abbreviations that they use commonly amongst each other. And that's going to be really stifling for new staff to be able to get up to speed. So there are real world limitations to this. Here's another problem. This list of abbreviations comes from a preprint article that I read recently. So it's something in my field. And the article was nearly unreadable because of the large list of abbreviations that were just then used throughout. And I think some of this stems from the fact that we like to publish with lots of content. Our articles, we want to have lots of content in our publications, but we have a word limit, and that word limit can make it difficult sometimes. I think that the move toward online publishing really should relax some of the word limit restrictions, because it's very difficult to read an article that uses 5 different abbreviations in the same sentence. And that really is restricting people's access to scientific information. I'd prefer to see fewer use of abbreviations in publications. There is evidence that common abbreviations, things like BBC, may be processed as a single word unit. And I think BMW is probably another one of those. NASA is another one. For instance, compared to meaningless letter strings like KWG, familiar ones like FBI are responded to better on a wide range of word recognition tasks. And here's where there's a lot of ability and the unique abilities that abbreviations offer. So acronyms and initialisms have very different orthographic to phonological mappings. And in fact, there's many initialisms that contain consonants with vowel sounding names. So F, L, M, N, R, S, X. These are all orthographically consonants, but when you pronounce them, they're actually pronounced as a vowel sound. Their initial sound is that of a vowel. So we can actually start to look at how orthography and phonology influence each other by manipulating various abbreviations. And in fact, the first study I did that I'll be talking to you in a minute, that's exactly what I did. And you can also think, I always try to relate things back also to computational models. So the dual root cascade model, the DRC model of word recognition, there's essentially 2 paths to meaning. There's a grapheme to phoneme correspondence route, where you take each letter and you turn it into a sound. That would work well for acronyms like NASA, but initialisms, it wouldn't work for, right? FBI would be pronounced as FUBI by the grapheme to phoneme correspondence rule. It wouldn't map onto anything. It would also give incorrect output for some initialisms. So it would, SOS would be pronounced as sauce, and IRS would be pronounced as ERS. There's also a direct visual route. That's the second route. Dual route, grapheme to phoneme is one, direct visual route is the other. The direct visual route would only work for familiar abbreviations. So again, this is an area where we know we can process abbreviations, we know people can read them, but we don't, the models that we use to theorize visual word recognition haven't fully taken these into account yet. So in the first study that I did quite a while ago when I was still a PhD student, I began because I was reading an article that kept discussing an fMRI study, and it just hit my ears as being wrong. An fMRI, or sorry, it was using a fMRI study, which just for me was not right. For me, I wanted to hear an fMRI because you use the indirect article an before a vowel sounding next word. And FBI starts with a vowel sound. As it turns out, it's a grammar rule that's not well known in English, that you should use an as the indirect article before any word that begins with a vowel. So, in fact, you should say an FBI, but you should say a CIA. So a CIA agent, an FBI agent. Similarly, with the letter U, you would say a university professor was carrying an umbrella. So the rule is based on the sound that's created, not the letter itself, not whether the letter is a vowel or a consonant, but the sound that letter makes. And it turns out that people don't understand this rule very well. So in looking at cases like FBI, initialisms that began with a consonant that had a vowel sound, only about 66% of the time was the rule applied correctly, compared to 99.7% of the time with CIA, according to with ones that were consistent, according to the American National Corpus, which also agreed with some offline rating experimental data that we collected. So what we did was we embedded these into sentences and preceded them with either a or an to see how long people fixated them. And you'll see here that we have ortho plus phono minus. So a FBI agrees with the normal orthography, the normal use of the indirect article according to orthography, but disagrees with phonology. An FBI disagrees with orthography, but agrees with phonology. A CIA agrees with both orthography and phonology, and an CIA disagrees with both. So then we looked at people's reading times. And one of the nice things about reading and reading studies and eye movement studies of reading is that with the eye movements, we can get a number of different processing measures. So we look at things like first fixation duration, which is considered the earliest measure of processing of a particular unit. And here, when we looked at first fixation duration, our earliest measure of processing, we found a strong phonological consistency effect of 19 milliseconds, but no orthographic consistency effect at all. So in our earliest measures, it seems that only sound matters, and that it's the sound representation of words that is influencing how they're processed from one word to the next. We only start to see signs of a orthographic consistency effect when we move to later processing measure gaze duration, which includes all the fixations on a word before leaving that word. But that effect doesn't become significant until we get to total time. Then we start to see a significant orthographic consistency effect, as it seems probably that some of the participants may have realized something additional was wrong with an CIA, which sounds wrong, but it also looks wrong. And at total time is, includes looks fixations that are looks back to the word, regressions back to the word. So obviously I can't hear you guys do this, but for yourself, try to read out aloud all of these different abbreviations. So this one's NFL, NBA, NHL, NCAA. How many people started by going NASA before realizing that it was NASA, right? There's ambiguity. There's ambiguity even in deciding how you're going to phonologically represent the letters within abbreviations. So how do readers know which orthographic to phonological mapping they should be using for abbreviations, right? Especially in the absence of biasing articles. So if you had an article that biases you, maybe you know if you see an and then NASA, maybe it is supposed to be NASA. But if you see maybe it's supposed to be NASA. So in the first paper, I only used initialisms. But you could ask the question, you can have a sentence like, the high-ranking NASA official attended the NCAA basketball championship game, right? So here, very similar looking constructions have very different orthographic to phonological mappings. So in 2011, when I was at UCSD working in Keith Rayner's lab, I conducted some research using the boundary technique to explore two hypotheses simultaneously. Hypothesis one, which we're calling the typographical hypothesis, was that readers could use typography as typographic information as a processing cue. Hypothesis two, which we're calling the legality hypothesis, was that readers could use orthographic letter combinations, orthographic legality as a processing cue. So some letters, like NC, don't really happen very often. Some letter combinations within especially within initialisms, for instance, FBI, there's no word in English that has an FB combination. It only happens in initialisms. So perhaps when readers see an illegal combination of letters, they know that it has to be an initialism instead of an acronym. So maybe they use that as a cue. So what we did is we took two different types of abbreviations, acronyms versus initialisms. Remember, the first study I talked about only used initialisms. And we also had a sentence case manipulation, either normal or all capital letters. And the reason for that is that normally abbreviations stand out. Acronyms, initialisms, they stand out. They're printed in uppercase letters in predominantly lowercase sentences. If you present the sentence in completely uppercase, people won't know where those abbreviations might be. And you can look at their processing when they haven't already been highlighted early on by the visual system as being unique or different. And we had three preview conditions. We had an identical, a legal, and an illegal. So the identicals for the acronym and initialism cases would have been things like NASA and NCAA, the exact same letter sequences in the target. Legal previews would be NUSO or NOBA. So these are ones that could be pronounced like words, where the letter sequences were just fine according to the English language. And finally, we had illegal letter sequences, NRSB and NRBA. And you'll note that for all of these previews, they differed from the identical condition by the same number of letters. So the legal and illegal shared just as much orthographic information with the actual target case. So any differences that we find, we can relate back to the fact that they were either legal and pronounceable or illegal and not pronounceable as words, but pronounceable as initialisms. We then placed this boundary right here just before the target word, so that as they cross the boundary, the preview would change into the target, NASA or NCAA. So if the typographical hypothesis is correct, we should see an effect of sentence case. If the legality hypothesis is correct, we should see a crossover interaction between abbreviation type and preview legality. So legal previews should be better than illegal ones for acronyms, while illegal previews should be better than legal ones for initialisms, because they give the reader a sense of how this letter sequence is ultimately going to be processed. And so if we focus just for a second on the normal case, you'll see that there's basically an identical effect So you're faster with the identical, but the illegal and legal didn't really significantly differ at all. However, in the capital, oh, that moved too far. In the capital case, there's a big difference. And again, you see that crossover interaction that we predicted with the legality hypothesis. That is, legal previews were better for acronyms and than illegal previews, but illegal previews were better for initialisms. So in the absence, let me get to, so essentially in the absence of typographical information, people can use legality to guide their orthographic to phonological mappings. However, when they do have an orthographic cue, when they do have a typographic cue, they can use that to alter their processing and even before they ever fixate the target words, and alter it in a qualitative sense, right? They're doing a different orthographic to phonological mapping in those cases. And that takes us to semantic processing. And I apologize, I might have to start going a little bit faster here. Oftentimes, abbreviations are misunderstood. They're especially common, misunderstandings are especially common with abbreviations. There are airline mishaps due to airport code confusions. And these go beyond just consumers purchasing a ticket thinking they're going to San Jose, California, and ending up in San Jose, Costa Rica. These are also cases where pilots fly to the wrong airport because they misread the airport codes. These have happened. Also, prescription drugs that had been abbreviated for a while, and it turned out there were some really dire effects for this. So people lost their lives because they were prescribed one drug by the doctor using an abbreviation that was misunderstood by the pharmacist. But there's very little research on novel abbreviations despite their widespread use. We make up new abbreviations all the time when we want to cut down on our word counts. It's commonplace, but we don't know much about how people process them. So that's what these last bits of my talk are going to be about. What I wanted to do was look at whether or not readers were activating the semantics of the base words of an abbreviation while they were reading them. So we created novel abbreviations with either high or low frequency base words. So you can see here, Extraordinary Science Awards Ceremony versus Ecological Scholars Algae Convention, where the top one is including high frequency words and the bottom one is including low frequency words. So when people later look at the word or the abbreviation ESAC, if they're actually reactivating something about the base words and remembering something about the base words, we should see a frequency effect in those later occurrences. So those abbreviations were embedded in text. And each passage contained only one version of the abbreviation. These abbreviations were first shown with the base words, then the abbreviation was shown in parentheses as it normally is in text. And then the abbreviation would appear 4 more times throughout the passage. And we collected eye movements from people as they read. So here's an example stimuli. As you can see here, we have a section. This is the Superficial Rehab Directional Program, SRDP. This is the base words. And then you see 1, 2, 3, 4 more occurrences throughout the passage. You can see if, yeah, there we go. So this is actually a video of someone's eye movements as they read. You can see them get to the base words. They go back to reread to make sure they understand what they're looking at, spend a long time looking at SRDP. And then when they get to the first occurrence of SDRP, they go back. They go back and they look again. All right, so I'm not going to play out the whole video, but you know that encompasses what I'm discussing, right? The fact that people don't necessarily know what SRDP means when they look at another example and they have to go back again. So we collected data with the iLink 1000 tracker. We had 36 native participants read the passages, silent reading for comprehension. We used 4 counterbalance lists, a random order of presentation, comprehension questions asked after every passage, and we included a non-abbreviated condition to control and find out how much benefit are people getting from using abbreviations. That's one of the things we're going to look at. This is just some item controls. I've passed on the presentation, so those who want to look at those controls can do so later. Abstract, we have 2 different predictions, 2 different hypotheses, an abstract referencing hypothesis and an abstract indexing. And the difference between these is that we're suggesting that the abstract referencing hypothesis is that readers create a gist of the base words, but that upon seeing the abbreviation, they reactivate something about those base words. And if that's the case, then the word frequency of those base words should influence the fixation durations on those abbreviations. And initialisms may show stronger frequency effects because they're less abstracted. And I say they're less abstracted because each letter in the initialism represents a word in the abbreviation, and each letter in the abbreviation has its own syllable. With acronyms, that's not the case. So acronyms are slightly more abstracted. This can be contrasted with our abstract indexing account, that readers create a placeholder for some abstract gist of the abbreviation without reference to the base words. So when they see the case here of extraordinary science awards ceremony, they might come up with a gist of something like, oh, a bunch of nerds. Who knows? So taking a look first at total passage reading time for these passages, as it turned out, the only effect that we got was a main effect of whether or not the passage had been abbreviated. And from this, we can also estimate that the benefit of abbreviating these 4-letter sequences was about 750 milliseconds per abbreviation. But the frequency didn't matter. Initialism versus acronym didn't matter. All that mattered was whether it was, abbreviated or not. Next, I'm going to zoom in closer and look at gaze duration. So this is a fairly early processing measure. The number, it's the sum of fixations on a target abbreviation before moving on. And we can see the low frequency words on top, the high frequency words on the bottom. Acronyms are on the left and initialisms are on the right. Only the exposure had a main effect here on gaze duration. So the more often a person saw the abbreviation, the further into the text, the faster, the shorter their gaze duration was, suggesting that they're learning something about how to represent these abbreviations. Looking at total time, we also found that same main effect of exposure, but now we also see an effect of the type. So initialisms resulted in longer processing, but no other significant effects. Frequency of the base words did not matter. Finally, in looking at skipping likelihood, people became much more likely to skip these words as the number of occurrences went up. So the first occurrence, they're less likely to skip, but by the time they get to the 4th occurrence of the abbreviation, they're much more likely to skip the target word. And that also interacted with the type of abbreviation. So interestingly, even though people were looking at initialisms longer, they were skipping them more often, more frequently. And I think the reason for that, well, I'll get to that after I sum up. So consistent with abstract indexing, readers appear to create some abstract representation of novel abbreviations with little lexical input from their base words. And this may explain why abbreviations are so often associated with miscommunication. We also saw that initialisms resulted in longer fixations, but more skips. And my thought on that was, which led into the next experiment, which I'll sum up quickly, is that with those types of novel initialisms, people didn't want to have to create a 4-letter, 4-syllable sequence to represent them. They just kind of went, yeah, right, that abbreviation-y thing, and just were moving on. So they were doing a very shallow level of processing. That conclusion was also further supported by the fact that we then started to explore how people were remembering the base words of these abbreviations. And it turns out that they're not remembering the base words at all in this study. In fact, we had to switch from trying to get them to do recall to doing a recognition memory task, because they just really weren't remembering what the base words of these abbreviations meant. Because of that, I wanted to see whether or not having people read them aloud would force readers to create more phonological representations and process these a bit deeper. And so we did experiment 2, where we had them read these aloud. I'm not going to go into too much. Everything else was basically the same, except having them read them aloud. As it turned out, we got a number of effects. First, gaze again decreases with exposure. This we saw in experiment 1. Gaze was also shorter for silent reading. That replicates lots of other studies. Gaze was shorter on acronyms. That replicates experiment 1 too. And the effect of reading aloud was greater on initialism. So when people had to read aloud, as I sort of thought, they were really being too shallow with their processing of initialisms in experiment 1. Forcing them to read them aloud, caused them to take a lot more time on the initialisms relative to the acronyms. And the total time effect mirrored the gaze duration. It was the same exact pattern of significance. With skipping, we found that, again, skipping increases with exposure, which we found before. Skipping was more likely with silent reading. That's been shown before. And acronyms were more likely to be skipped than initialisms now, which was interesting because in the prior study, it had been initialisms that had been skipped more. But I was assuming, again, that they were processing them more shallowly. I take this as sort of suggestive evidence that's likely what was happening in that study. So consistent with experiment 1, we again had no evidence of abstract referencing. Initialisms took longer to process than acronyms, especially when reading aloud. And I think that's likely due to the need to create a detailed phonological representation when you want to read something aloud. It's not enough to just process it shallowly. You have to process it more deeply. So what about the future of abbreviations? Well, they appear to be here to stay, despite the confusion they cause. They're on the rise. They continue to grow. However, we can learn to use them more effectively, more efficiently, and hopefully thereby avoiding some of the confusion that they create and increase the quality of our own written communications. I think there's a number of ways that we can do that. I would recommend, if people are using abbreviations, that, if they're going to use an abbreviation a lot, every so often maybe repeat the base words again with it to remind a reader what this means. Only make abbreviations when you really have to. I've sat in on meetings now, and many of you who are listening to this probably have sat in on meetings too, where the whole conversation is, how do we come up with a fun acronym or abbreviation that everybody will remember for this particular term or this new program that we're developing? And the whole meeting is about developing a new abbreviation. Well, maybe don't. Maybe focus on just communicating good semantic information. How will abbreviations evolve? I'm not sure. I'm guessing that things will move toward a system where people try to create more acronyms than initialisms. I'd really like to see a corpus of abbreviations, similar to a lot of the word frequency corpora that exist. that could code things like, what their base words were, so that people can, language researchers can start exploring these topics a bit more. I think there's a lot that we can learn from how people process abbreviations as they read and what it says about language research, language processing in general. And that takes me to the end. I want to make sure I give some special thanks to the people who especially contributed to those last couple studies that I talked about on semantic processing. Adam Parker, who is currently a postdoc at Oxford, Martin Vasilev, who was my postdoc at Bournemouth, but who is now a faculty member at Bournemouth, and Victoria Adedeji, who is a current PhD student of mine. Ta-ta for now. Talk to you later.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was great to know a little bit about this topic that hasn't been very much investigated, and I think we can come up with some very interesting experiments to further investigate this, right?
I think so.
Yeah, and we have some comments and some questions from the audience. Let me get to them. Okay, so first some comments. Abbreviations are a challenge for academic translation, especially in the medical domain.
Yes. Yep.
And then another comment, it's funny how some abbreviations take no article at all, while others are always preceded by the article the definite article. Then a question. I guess that Tatiana Kirish asked the question. I guess that people who work at NASA would be less likely to pronounce the acronym by spelling it out. Has there been any study on the effect of previous knowledge and on the reading of acronyms?
I don't know of any, though I'm interested actually in trying one. So I have a colleague in Leicester, Sarah White, who has done research with medical experts and the words that they know, because they're and obviously acronyms are big there. She wasn't looking specifically at acronyms. She was looking at their understanding of terminology, which is often very low frequency words, and how their reading of those would differ from non-experts, from students, students who weren't medical students, right? And so I think that I want to collaborate with her on a project exactly like that. We've been talking about trying to do that, where we look at maybe medical terminology and the abbreviations in medical texts, and how medical students and non-medical students look at them and how they process them. And yeah, so that is something that I think is really would be really important to do, but I don't think it's been done yet.
It's still Tatiana is rephrasing her question. She's saying that her question is, does previous knowledge mediate the reading of acronyms? But I think
yeah, I mean, it could. Obviously, when we talk about word frequency, we're always talking about it as a proxy, right? The idea here is that words that are high frequent have been seen many times by a reader. And so their representation in memory has been strengthened with each additional exposure. So I would expect that, something similar would happen with abbreviations. In fact, we saw that exposure within a single passage had quite a strong impact on how long it took people to look at and process those abbreviations as they read them, even when they were reading aloud. So I would expect that prior experience would mediate that. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure how it would mediate it. Those who know the base words may process them slightly differently than those who don't.
So João Luis Coelho asked, Professor Slattery, do you think that abbreviations and acronyms are important topics of discussion for English as a second language learners?
Ooh, quite possibly. And I'll say that while I have tried to become an effective bilingual, I'm not. I know very little Spanish. I've tried. I'm not very good at it. So I'm not sure how, and I don't know how prevalent abbreviations are in other languages, though I imagine most alphabetic languages have quite a lot of abbreviation use. I haven't really explored, though, how they may differ in terms of the orthographic to phonological mappings in other languages. So to the extent that they're different when a learner is learning English as opposed to, speaking in their first language, it could be important. Yeah.
So I think this, for the students that are looking for a topic for their study, this is something that they can look for, right? And
yeah, I've had a few student projects that were run with abbreviations that were quite successful, looking at how much people know about their meaning, how costly miscommunications are, things like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, here in Brazil, we could carry out some study with Brazilian
Absolutely.
Portuguese.
I would be happy, and if people wanted to collaborate with me, I would be more than happy to help advise or collaborate and help out in any way I can.
Great. So Professor Mayusi is asking, Tim, can you talk about the reading of abbreviations in English by non-native speakers? It's a related question. I think.
Okay, say that again.
If you can talk about the reading of abbreviations in English by non-native speakers.
Yeah, so you're probably gonna have potentially double difficulty as non-native speakers, right? So now you've got multiple possible orthographic to phonological mappings, and so alphabetic letters will sound different. So in the UK, for instance, they don't say Z, they say Z. And so any abbreviation that contained the letter, for me, what I would say Z, would be said Z. And this is essentially the same language. There's slightly different, there's slight differences, but they're very, very similar. And even though they're very similar, you still have additional problems, with abbreviations, especially those that contain certain letter sequences. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. So still lots of things to investigate. As I said before, we can do some studies with Brazilian Portuguese and also with L2 English speakers here. So another question, Fernanda Alves asked, Professor Slattery, do you think that we should avoid new abbreviations and acronyms in texts to enhance reading comprehension then? You talked a little bit about this during.
Yeah, so I would say, try to avoid making too many of them. If there's one common thing that you're talking about over and over again in a paper, and that one thing sort of makes a nice nucleus idea, sure, make an abbreviation out of it. But, I think sometimes people are like, well, how many times have I used this little phrase? Let me make an abbreviation out of that. And now I'll save on my word count. I'll cut out 5 words from my work. They do too much of that happens. And then it makes an article, just unreadable. It becomes really, really difficult to read. So I think people should just be, wise about choosing when they're going to create abbreviations and when they're going to avoid creating abbreviations. And then when you create an abbreviation, you want to think about things like, how do I want readers to pronounce this? How would I expect a reader to pronounce this? How would I expect a reader to use or a writer to use this in if they were to write a new text, right? So spend some time, thinking about it. because eventually, if it's used enough, it's going to become a word, right? It's going to become, you know, what we would say lexicalized. So BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, I think. Ooh, I don't even see. I don't know if that's the right base word. Probably is. You know, now it's just a thing, right? It's a news channel. It's a broadcast channel. And so, you know, if you're going to be creating new words, probably want to put a little bit of thought into, you know, creating ones that are going to be useful and efficient.
Exactly. I think what you just said is very much related to the next question. Pietra Cassol Rigatti asked, Professor Slattery, is reading acronyms similar to reading usual words? Could very frequent abbreviations be read in a similar way?
Yes, I think they are. And there's an excellent article by Mark Brysbaert on which essentially is there room in the lexicon. I think the title is there room in the lexicon for the BBC, where he's making that argument. And in fact, in that article, he was able to show that uppercase and lowercase doesn't really matter when you have these lexicalized abbreviations. So seeing lowercase b, lowercase c, you sort of activate that BBC sort of lexical representation the same way the capital letter sequence does. Now, when you see it in a written passage, I think there's still going to be, you know, effects of letter case that could happen because people get parafoveal processing that happens before they even look at the word or the abbreviation. But yeah, I think that you would find that, and I highly recommend Mark's paper. I thought it was an excellent paper, one of my favorites.
Great. Maria Cristina Fonseca asked, when you mention using the wrong form of indefinite article, mispronunciation are produced by native speakers. So she wants to know if native speakers also mispronounce A and N in front of abbreviations. So
we didn't have them read that aloud. And actually, that would be a really great study to do, to be able to probe. You know, we could have, we didn't. That was all silent reading. So I don't know the answer to that question, though I think I hinted it a couple times that I kind of believe an article is going to bias you. So if you have the article "an," you're going to want to start processing a vowel sound. And so if you see the letter N after it, you're going to NFL executive, right? But if you had the abbreviation, if you had the article then it may very well bias you to pronounce a capital N as N. So NASA representative. So I think that may occur, but I don't know. I did not test that. I did not probe that. That would be a good study.
I would very much like to study this both with native speakers and with English learners as a second language.
Yeah. Especially if there were some letters where the letter name in the English alphabet starts with a vowel sound, but that same letter in the second language or the first language, whichever way you want to go about it, in the other language didn't start with a vowel sound. That would be if those letters exist in the alphabet, then that would be really fun to play with.
Yes. Well, this would be my question, but you have already answered it. I would ask you if the L2 learners would have more difficulty applying the article A and N in front of abbreviations than the native speakers. But this will be a question for a research project, right? We'll talk about this later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I just have one more question. Is it okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah? Yep, that's fine.
So Bruno Mello asked, Professor Slattery, do you think that the great amount of abbreviations created by teenagers on social media could be more emphasized in academic studies?
There have been a few studies that have looked at it. Is the question, should it be more? Should we look at it more? Could we look at it more?
I think it is.
Yeah, I think we probably could. And it would be interesting to look at how these things evolve, because as I said, right, I pronounced LOL as LOL. Even though all along when it was first created, it could have been pronounced LOL. I just didn't. And part of that could have been because I'm old enough that I had AOL, which was America Online. And so we would pronounce that AOL. And then when you were messaging on AOL and said LOL, it all seemed to fit. But it may be the case that abbreviations that can be pronounced as acronyms eventually evolve to be pronounced as acronyms. There's neat evolution in language where you find words that co-occur quite often, become these sort of spaced compound words. Then they often become a hyphenated compound word. And often now, if you type two of those into Microsoft Word, it'll underline it with two blue lines. And then when you sort of right click on it, it'll tell you to put a hyphen between them. Okay. And eventually that can lead to them becoming non-hyphenated, put together non-hyphenated, non-spaced compound words. And so there may be a similar evolution with abbreviations where those that can be pronounced as acronyms, but were initially pronounced as initialisms, eventually turn into acronyms. That could be, I don't know, I don't have the data because we really don't have a database of abbreviations. We don't have a good abbreviation corpora. And I think it'd be great if we had one.
So another suggestion for a research project, if someone is interested in. I
think that one probably needs a lot of grant money. That's probably a lot of work, but yeah.
Well, I said we were done with the questions, but there is just one more that I think you have already answered, but I'll read it. Maria Cristina Fonseca is asking, she's saying, many acronyms that have become words like rather and even NASA and BBC.
Scuba.
So are they processed as words or acronyms?
Words.
Yeah.
Yeah, these things become lexicalized, and that's what a lot of Mark Brysbaert's paper was on. So, yeah. They appear to be processed like words. They enjoy the same processing advantages over meaningless letter strings that words enjoy. So
yes. So thank you very much for answering these questions.
Thank you for all the
excellent questions. Thank you very much for the talk.
You're welcome.
Would you like to say some final words to the audience?
I guess maybe TTFN, TTYL.
All right.
Okay.
So I would like to thank the audience for being with us today again. And I would like to thank again Professor Tim Slattery for accepting the invitation. It was great to have this topic today. And I see you all next week for the next talk. Yes, so thank you all. Bye.
Thanks, bye.